This week, we are continuing with chapter 2, and we are going to focus more specifically on the relationship between aging, work, retirement, longevity, and care. Last week, we introduced the concept of the risk society and began thinking about how modern societies respond to the challenges associated with an aging population. We also looked at Abramson and Portocolon's argument that aging is deeply connected to inequality. People do not arrive at old age with equal resources, and the risks associated with later life are not distributed equally. This week, we are going to build on those ideas by thinking about what happens when people live longer. Living longer is generally considered one of the great achievements of modern society. Improvements in medicine, public health, nutrition, sanitation, and living conditions have dramatically increased life expectancy. But longer lives also create new social questions. If people are living longer, how long should they work? When should people retire? How should retirement be funded? Who should provide care when people need assistance? And perhaps most importantly, who is responsible for making sure people can live those additional years with security and dignity? These are not simply personal questions. They are sociological questions because the answers are shaped by social institutions, economic systems, cultural expectations, and government policies. Chapter 2 introduces us to this problem through the relationship between aging, work, and pensions. Historically, retirement became an important social institution, partly because societies developed systems that allowed older adults to leave paid employment while still having some form of economic support. In many countries, retirement became associated with a particular age and with the expectation that people would eventually exit the labor force. But increasing longevity has complicated that arrangement. If people live significantly longer after retirement, then retirement may last 20 or 30 years rather than just a relatively short period of time. That creates questions about who is going to finance those years. Governments have to consider the cost of public pension systems, employers have to consider the cost of retirement benefits, and individuals are increasingly encouraged to think about how they will finance their own retirement. This is where the idea of the risk society comes back into the conversation. One response to increasing longevity has been to encourage people to work longer. Powell discusses how British policy has increasingly encouraged older adults to remain in the workforce rather than automatically leaving employment at a traditional retirement age. At first, this might sound like a simple economic solution. If people live longer, they can work longer. If they work longer, they can contribute to the economy for more years and spend fewer years relying on retirement benefits. But sociology asks us to look at the situation more closely. Can everyone actually work longer? The answer is clearly no. People age differently. Some people remain healthy and physically capable of working well into their 70s. Others develop disabilities or chronic health conditions much earlier. Some people have jobs that are physically demanding, while others work in occupations that are easier to continue later in life. And then there is the question of economic necessities. Someone who enjoys their career and wants to work until age 70 might experience longer working life very differently from someone who has to continue working because they cannot afford to retire. So when we hear the idea that people should simply work longer because people are living longer, we need to ask a sociological question. Who actually has the ability to make that choice? This is an important connection to what we discussed last week about inequality. Retirement is not experienced equally. Neither is work in later life. Someone who has spent their career in a physically demanding occupation may have a very different experience from someone who has worked in an office. Someone with a generous pension may have more freedom to retire than someone who has little retirement savings. Someone with access to healthcare may be better able to continue working than someone whose health needs are more significant. So, even though retirement is often treated as an individual decision, it is deeply influenced by social structures. This brings us to our supplemental reading for this week, Michael Fine's article, Nurturing Longevity Sociological Constructions of Aging, Care, and the Body. Fine asks us to think about another consequence of longer lives: care. His argument is particularly interesting because he pushes back against an overly simple sociological understanding of aging. Earlier in this course, we talked about social construction. We discussed how aging is not simply a biological process, but is also shaped by social meanings, institutions, and relationships. Fine agrees that social relationships and social institutions matter, but he argues that we should not forget that aging is also an embodied physical process. Bodies change, people can develop disabilities, people can experience limitations in mobility, people can eventually need assistance with activities that they once performed independently. And those physical realities can create genuine needs for care. Fine argues that sociology needs to take the body seriously when thinking about care and later life. This is an important complication to the idea of social constructions. Sometimes sociologists can become so focused on the ways society constructs meanings that we forget that people also have physical bodies with real needs. For example, imagine someone who develops significant mobility limitations in very old age. We could certainly study the social meaning attached to disability. We could examine discrimination, accessibility, social expectations, and the ways institutions respond to disability. All of those things are important. But we also have to recognize that the person may physically need assistance getting dressed, preparing food, bathing, or moving around their home. Those needs are not simply social constructions, they are embodied experiences. Fine, therefore, asks us to think differently about care. Care is not merely something society provides to people who are considered dependent. Care is part of human social life. At different points in our lives, we may provide care to other people, receive care from other people, or do both simultaneously. Children require care. People who become ill may require care. People with disabilities may require care. And many people eventually require some form of assistance as they reach advanced old age. This means that dependency is not necessarily an unusual or pathological condition. It can be a normal part of the human life course. That idea is particularly important in a society that places a tremendous value on independence. In the United States and other highly individualistic societies, independence is often treated as a marker of success. We are taught to be self sufficient. We are encouraged to take care of ourselves. We are often uncomfortable with the idea of needing assistance from other people. But Fine's argument invites us to question that assumption. What if needing care is not a personal failure? What if dependence is simply one part of being human? And what would society look like if we designed our institutions around that reality? This also brings us back to the issue of gender. Historically, much of the unpaid care work within families has been performed by women. That means that the question of who provides care is also a question about gender inequality. When an older adult needs assistance, someone has to provide that assistance. That person might be a spouse, an adult child, a daughter in particular historically, another family member, a paid home care worker, a nursing facility, or some combination of these. Each arrangement has social and economic consequences. If family members provide unpaid care, that care can affect their employment, income, relationships, and health. If care is purchased privately, then access depends partly on financial resources. If the government provides support, then questions arise about eligibility, taxation, public spending, and social responsibility. Again, what initially looks like a personal family matter becomes a sociological issue. This is one of the things I want you to notice throughout this course. Many of the problems associated with aging occur at the intersection of the individual and society. A person may need care, but society determines what kinds of care are available. A person may want to retire, but economic conditions determine whether retirement is financially possible. A person may want to continue working, but their health, occupation, employer, and experiences of age discrimination can affect whether that is possible. So, when we talk about longevity, we are not simply talking about adding years to an individual's life. We are talking about adding years to the social institutions and relationships that surround that person. More years of life can mean more years of work, more years of retirement, more years with family, more years of relationships and social participation. And for some people, more years of living with disability or needing assistance. This is why the concept of longevity is sociologically complicated. Longer life is not automatically the same thing as better life. The quality of those additional years matters, and the resources available during those years matter. This is also where we can connect this week's readings to the idea of successful aging. We often hear the phrase successful aging as though there is a formula for doing aging correctly. Stay healthy, stay active, keep working, exercise, eat well, remain independent, stay socially engaged. These can all be positive things, but sociology asks us to think about the assumptions hidden inside that ideal. What happens to people who cannot remain completely independent? What happens to someone who develops a disability? What happens to someone who cannot afford the resources associated with healthy aging? And what happens when a person's body simply requires assistance? Fine's argument helps us recognize that needing care does not necessarily mean that someone has failed at aging. Sometimes bodies simply require assistance. The sociological question is what we do with that reality. Do we treat care as a private family responsibility? Do we treat it as a public responsibility? Do we expect individuals to purchase care through the market? Do we expect women to provide unpaid care? Or do we develop social systems that distribute the responsibility more broadly? These are fundamentally questions about how society understands responsibility. And that brings us back to the risk society. As governments and institutions respond to population aging, they have to decide how responsibility for later life will be distributed among individuals, families, employers, markets, and the state. That distribution is not neutral. It reflects cultural values and political choices. It can also reproduce inequality. People with more resources generally have more options. They may be able to retire earlier. They may be able to purchase assistance. They may be able to modify their homes. They may be able to move closer to family. They may have more choices about how they spend later life. People with fewer resources may have fewer choices. So, one of the central questions of this week is not simply how can we help people live longer? It is how should society organize itself around longer lives? That is a much bigger question. And it is one that we will continue returning to throughout this course. As you finish the readings this week, I want you to think about the relationship between longevity, work, retirement, and care. What happens when people live longer? Who benefits from longer lives? Who carries the costs? Who is expected to work longer? Who is expected to provide care? And who should be responsible for making sure that people can live their later years with dignity? These questions remind us of one of the central lessons of sociology. Growing older may happen to our bodies, but the way we organize work, retirement, care, and dependency is something that societies create. And because societies create these systems, societies can also change them.